Hi, this is Scott at Therapy for Kids and startatherapypractice.com. And I'm here with Barbara Kornblau, and she is an attorney and an occupational therapist. I'm not going to go into what Barbara is credentialed in because it would take too long, but I want Barbara, I want you to highlight what you're doing now, what your credentials are, where you're at, and what all you're doing. But first, I want to thank you for joining me. Thank you so much, Barbara.
Well, thank you for having me, Scott. As you mentioned, I'm an occupational therapist and an attorney. I have several certifications that I went out and got. A lot of them were because I had personal issues that I needed to be able to say, I'm certified in that. So I'm a certified case manager. I case manage myself and my kids. I have a lot of chronic conditions. I became a certified pain educator so that I could tell the doctors, I'm a certified pain educator. I'm not just a stupid patient. You have to listen to me. And some other things I've gotten along the way, some honorifics, along the way. Right now, I am a professor at Florida A&M University, but I teach from a distance. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, where I run a small nonprofit called the Coalition for Disability Health Equity. And I'm very involved in policy, mostly disability and health policy. I worked on the Affordable Care Act, and I wrote the sections on disability issues, all but one. And I helped write the anti-discrimination policies that are also in the Affordable Care Act. So I look at things and I see something I don't like and I say, I've got to change that. And interestingly, I really became involved with that early in my career. I did some private practice work, and I realized that there were policies that prevented me from getting paid and preventing my patients from being able to do things. So policy became very important to me as a clinician and as a private practice person. So that's where I emphasize my time right now with policy. I also run a return to work program for the United Spinal Association, helping people with newly acquired spinal cord injuries return to work. So that's where I am right now.
Tell us what a typical day is.
I was going to say, I don't know if there is a typical day. It depends if I'm teaching that day. A lot of what I do for the United Spinal Program is involved with policy, and it's basically setting up like a private practice. I'm a consultant to them. And a lot of what I had to do was put together policies so that people entering the program would understand where they stand in terms of benefits. So if I go back to work, do I lose my benefits? What policies are in place? And so I had to become very familiar with Social Security disabilities policies and how people are able to return to work. So you can keep your health insurance for a certain number of years, your Medicare. What happens if you start working? What happens if you start working and you need the services of an attendant, or you need to buy a wheelchair? How are those things deducted from your benefits? So a lot of what I had to put together were basically all the policies involved in returning to work. So
you mentioned that. Go ahead.
I may be involved with some consulting on that. I do a lot of webinars and outreach and instruction and support for that program. I also do some other consulting.
Okay. You mentioned that you were in private practice in the past. At one point in your career, did that happen? That was before you became a licensed attorney or after? And what interested you in becoming a private practice owner?
Well, I started, I went to law school at night because, ironically, on my way driving down to Florida to start law school, I was in a car accident. So I couldn't do a full load of school. The books you have to carry for law school were just, like 100 pounds of books, and it was just impossible. So I got OT, or actually I got PT during the day, and then I went to school at night. And when the OT department found out there was an OT getting PT, they came in and interviewed me on the table. And I said, I don't want, I'm in school. I'm not doing this now. And they said, we need you just until we hire someone. So I started working there, and I think I would still be there if I hadn't left. But being there, I got connected with home care, and I started to do home care, and I started to do on my own patients. So I was developing the practice that way. And then this was a time I was in Miami, and the nursing home market was just booming. This was after the DRGs, around the same time the DRGs passed, so everything was being shifted to long-term care and getting people out. So I would see a nursing home being built, and I would bring brownies to the construction trailer and ask them to call me when they hired an administrator, and then I would go in and swoop in and be the first one there and get the contract. And then I started reading the newspaper. I read the business section, and I would look at who was buying property and what company it was. And I knew who the nursing home investment companies were. So I would follow that piece of property, wait till the construction trailer came, and go through that same thing. So I had contracts at a bunch of nursing homes. I had contracts with most of the home care agencies. And then I would subcontract and hire people as independent contractors under me. And this was while I was in law school. And when I graduated, I decided I didn't want to work for anybody else. So I hung a shingle for law upstairs, and OT was downstairs, and I started a work hardening program. So that was kind of in the same building. And then I went through a divorce, so I kind of had to cut back and get a full-time job, because private practice is not always, in the beginning, it's not that steady. And mine was growing so quickly that it was just leaps and bounds out of control. So then I was doing some just pretty much contract work on the side.
Now, take us back and look through your attorney lens as far as when you began your private practice. Through your attorney lens, what mistakes did you make, and what would you take away from that, what you learned?
Well, I think when I hired people, when I started my work hardening program, I hired someone, and I had a non-compete clauses, and I didn't really enforce things. So I don't know if that was such a mistake, but looking back, it was okay because things ended well. But that probably was something that had I stayed in the private practice, I should have enforced that. So that would have been one thing. I think also was growing too quickly. I had a partner that didn't really work out. I was doing most of the work. And when you have a partnership, you have to both have a 50-50 partnership and a 50-50 commitment in time. And that was a problem for me as well. Other than that, I think, things would have been better to have more capital going into things, and because growing quickly is a problem. But after that, most of what I've been doing has been consulting, and that's not so capital intensive. I mean, I had a warehouse for a work hardening program, and it really took a lot. It was a lot of space, a lot of rent, and it kind of happened very quickly. But for that, we had a lot of fun. We used to go to the county surplus store and buy junk. Things we didn't know what they were, but they were things that people could take apart and put back together again. Sometimes we'd have workers come in the work hardening program, and they'd say, "Oh, that's a widget-a-giggin." It's like, "Oh, that's what that is." I just thought it looked like fun to take apart and put together again. So it was an interesting experience, and as an OT, it was just the heart of creativity. But now it's hard to get clients. It's not something that's paid for. We were on the forefront, so we were constantly having to do presentations to explain what this is and why you should pay for it.
You mentioned that you had a partner there. From a legal aspect, give us some insight. If a person is wanting to start a private practice and they want to do a partnership, what advice would you have for those people?
Well, you need to have everything in writing, and 50-50 on paper sounds great, but there's a problem when you split a partnership. It's worse than a divorce, because you're losing your partner, your friend, and trying to figure out how to keep your a business going. How do you divide those contacts? Who's made the contacts? So I almost don't recommend it unless it's maybe easier to have like a PT and an OT, because if you split, you can just split the PT and the OT separately. But in terms of two OTs together, it's tough, unless one of you is peds and one of you is geriatrics, or you have a definitive way that you can divide things later, because that breakup can be very, very difficult. And it's just so important to have not just your agreement in writing, but your rules. When it's the end of the month and it's the time to do billing, everybody's got to be on hand, all hands on deck, because that's your heavy duty time period. You can't have somebody going on vacation every month. You really have to have the same common commitment. And it's hard to find anybody who has the same commitment that you do, no matter what your commitment is, whether it's a lot of commitment or not a lot of commitment. That's a problem, unless it's, a husband and wife team where this is your family business.
Yes, and that's usually the advice I give if a therapist is asking me as far as a partnership, or they might not even ask, but usually I'll give the same advice of there's going to be somebody who's got more invested in it time-wise and effort-wise than another person. My wife and I are both OTs, so we're essentially partners. And yeah, that works different if you're married to the person than if you just are kind of friends. I always say it's a good way to ruin a good friendship, to start a partnership.
Yes, yes, it is. Although it can also ruin a marriage. Again, it depends on your commitment. And I'd like to think that, if you're married, you have that commitment.
Right.
And more of a reason if you have a family than friends who have commitments to their spouses and, their way of doing things.
Exactly. I asked you here before our actual live broadcast if you would have any advice on a legal setup or any uh, legal insights for a therapist who's just now thinking about starting a practice, but they haven't pulled the trigger as far as getting any paperwork together. What kind of insight can you give them?
Well, I usually get calls from OTs after the fact, after they're, quote, as my kids would say, in trouble. And I can't stress enough, it's worth an investment in the beginning to sit down and talk with someone. And, I can recommend like SCORE, the Senior Corps of Retired Executives. Sometimes that may be the person you want to talk to. It may not necessarily have to be an attorney. If you do meet with an attorney, try and find someone who knows something about what we do. Maybe ask a PT if they have used someone. Sometimes you have a doctor who's afraid to say to you, I don't know something about, I don't know that condition, or I can't answer that. You have lawyers with the same thing. They're not going to say to you, I don't know that. I've never met a lawyer other than me who will say, I don't know anything about that area of law. You ask me a tax question, I'm not going to answer it. I don't know. My husband's an accountant. I don't answer tax questions. It gives me chills. But finding a lawyer who's willing to say that is tough. So you have to do some digging and ask questions, because what we do is somewhat unique. I think it's important, if you're going to have contracts with facilities, with nursing homes, with home care agencies, have someone look over a basic contract. Most of them are the same. I mean, the home care agencies, I think they all stole the same contract from somewhere. I've never seen one that's different. And read it, because there are things in it, like you have to keep your records for 5 years. Why? Because it's in the contract. But that's not the only reason. Medicare requires it, because Medicare can come in and do an audit of you. So you have to keep those records. So you need to comply with what's in that contract. On the other hand, there may be things in contracts, if you're going to go into a facility to do treatment, the facility may try and shift all of the liability to you. And these are things that you're not expected to understand because you're not a lawyer. So you need to have a lawyer read that and just say, can you explain to me, what are the downsides to me? How can I get in trouble? How can I be burdened from this contract? And they should be able to at least give you that kind of information. I think there are also some ethical issues that get involved where people don't realize that they're doing a program that's really treatment, and maybe in your state you need to have a referral. Maybe you don't need to have a referral, but you need to be aware of when something is treatment and when something is not. So, for example, if you're going to run a camp for kids with disabilities and you're an OT, well, maybe that would not be OT if it was run by someone else. But if you're running it and you're making determinations based on somebody's functional level of where they are and what classes they're taking or what sports in camp or whatever, that may come back to haunt you later, because it may be determined that it's therapy and you were doing therapy without an evaluation, which is a breach of our standards of practice and code of ethics. You didn't do an evaluation, yet you made a determination of an intervention. So you need to be careful with these things. You need, talk to other people, get a mentor. I highly recommend having a mentor for some of these things to see, does this make sense what I'm doing? Because otherwise I get those calls after the fact. I'm in trouble with the licensure board. I did this. I didn't think there was anything wrong at the time, but now I'm beginning to think maybe there was a problem. What do I do?
Is there a website recommendation or a go-to place where you're like, hey, you probably ought to pay attention to this and keep abreast of this information over here? I mean, I'm sure AOTA's got information as far as, practices. Do you have any other go-to places?
Well, I hate to do shameless promotion, but I did write a book on ethics.
Yes.
With Ann Burkhardt. But one of the things that I like about the way we did this book, I mean, we did it to be practical, is it gives you a framework of questions to ask yourself and what to go through to kind of process these things. And in the back, there are like 125 examples of ethical dilemmas that have really occurred in practice that we've collected. And I think having an understanding of just the process, the thinking process that you go through to figure out, you know, am I going to get in trouble if I do this? Is this right? Do I feel good about my decisions? You know, what am I doing here? Is there a legal problem? Is there an ethical problem? I think those are all very, very important. And I think sometimes, you know, we go through those boundaries. And one of the examples I like to give is in states where you don't require a referral. Okay, there are a lot of states under our licensure law, you only need a prescription to bill insurance. If you're not billing insurance, there's nobody that's going to say to you, hey, you need a prescription. So if you consider, you know, let's say I have 6 kids. 4 of them had OT in their lives. I have 2 adult sons on the autism spectrum. I've got a daughter with CP, learning. They all had learning disabilities, all kinds of things, and they got OT, and I paid for it. You know, it was never covered by insurance. I knew they needed it. I paid for it. So if I'm paying for it, the OT doesn't have to bill the insurance. So people think, okay, then I don't have to have records. I don't have to write progress notes. I don't have to do any of that stuff. And that's a problem because our standards of practice say that you have to keep records. And all the licensure laws, or virtually all of them, say that you have to keep records. So theoretically, someone could file a complaint against you with the licensure board and say, I didn't like the therapy that this person was providing. And the licensure board is going to say, okay, we got a complaint against you. Send us your notes. And it's like, what notes? Well, that's, you know, documentation is to show that you are practicing according to standards. And if you don't have any, that's not, you can lose your license, you can lose your, you know, certification, you can lose everything over that for something that you think is not a big deal. But we're still professionals, no matter who's paying us. There are certain basic standards that we have to abide by. And one of them is to keep progress notes, to keep a chart. I've had OTs call me because they didn't know they had to keep progress notes, which I don't know how they don't know that because I teach that in every class. But there was a divorce. And there's a fight over who gets the kid. And they're talking about, well, the mom says she does the home program and the dad doesn't. And the dad says the mom never takes the kid to therapy on time. So they subpoena the OT to ask, well, you know, who's doing a better job with the kid? And the OT is like, well, I don't know. I don't have any notes. I mean, I know the mom said this, but, well, when did she say that? Well, I don't remember. So you can get yourself into trouble just because you're in private practice. It doesn't change your level of professionalism, and in fact, it should raise it.
Yes. Yes, I agree with that. Because you essentially you're more liable. I mean, if you have to show up in court, you better have some paperwork.
Absolutely. And if you don't have a prescription, then theoretically you're the only one liable because you're not practicing under the supervision of physician's prescription. Now, I don't think that's absolutely necessary, but I would recommend it if you had a complicated patient. So if you had someone who was private pay but was medically complicated, you know, medically complicated child who maybe reached, you know, now supposedly there's no limits on out-of-pocket, but in the old days, if you reached an out-of-pocket and you were seeing a child a couple of times a week for maintenance, you would want to keep records of that. You would want to have a prescription from the physician so that everything you're doing is kind of approved. I don't think it's necessary if you're running a ballet program for kids with learning disabilities, if you're doing I had a former student who had a program where she was doing social skills at the bowling alley on Friday nights with kids on the autism spectrum. I don't think you need a prescription for that. You know, certainly most things probably not, but if it's something medically complicated and you know that you're billing yourself or it's self-pay, then I would get a prescription so that the medical provider knows that you're doing this.
Now, whether you need a prescription or not, referring to direct access, that's governed by the local state laws, whoever's licensing locally state-wise, right? That would be where a therapist finds that out.
Right, the local licensure law. And if it doesn't say you need it, then chances are you don't, unless you bill. You know, when an insurance company says that they only pay for medically necessary services, which is what you bill, that means that there's a prescription written by a physician, basically, that some physician determines that the service is medically necessary. If you are doing your private pay, then you don't have to worry about it. There are also some states that have a little different exception. It might be for consultation or a one-time visit. So you need to know what your Practice Act says, but you need to know what your Practice Act says anyway, because that governs what you do.
I want you to mention again the name of the book that you referenced just a little bit ago.
Sure, it's Ethics and Rehabilitation, and it's by me, Barbara Kornblau, and Ann Burkhart, and it's published by Slack. And it's a workbook kind of book, so I think that it's something helpful.
I'll put a link in the show notes here on my webpage at startatherapypractice.com, and that way people can check that out for sure.
Cool.
Now, you said you mentioned, go ahead.
Well, it has examples. I mentioned over 100 examples. It covers peds, covers geriatric, psych, everything.
Excellent, excellent. You mentioned that you do some webinars, some classes, some talks. What are those topics that you cover?
Well, I've done a series of webinars for occupationaltherapy.com. I did a series on occupational therapy and pain because I think it's the state of Oregon that's requiring OTs to take continuing education in pain management. So I did those, and I've done some on falls disability, like evidence-based and why people with disabilities falls and fall prevention, what we know. I've also done a bunch on the Americans with Disabilities Act and on the Affordable Care Act and what it means for people with disabilities. So I've put together some, part of my private practice is I do grants with some organizations, and they have me put on webinars to them under grants.
Okay.
A lot of policy related. But I think that if I was starting out again, if I was going back, I think there's so much opportunity now for private practice and a lot of things for self-pay, like the one that my former student did with the social skills in the bowling alley. I think that there are so many kids now on the autism spectrum and the need to transition to adulthood. And I can tell you that my own experience, I was trying to find an OT who would work on social skills with my son. And so I called a local hospital, and I called the OT in the psych hospital, the children's hospital. And I said, I need an OT to do, social skills with my son who's on the autism spectrum. And she said, well, I'm not in private practice. I said, well, you don't have to be. You come to my house and I'll pay you. And she said, well, what do I do with the money? I said, you spend it. And she said, well, how do I bill you? I said, well, I can give you cash or a check. And if you want to know what to do legitimately with the money, you can ask my husband. He's an accountant. He'll tell you. If not, I don't really care what you do with the money. She said, but I only do groups. I said, well, I have 6 kids. So you tell me how big a group you want, and I'll make sure that they're home. And she ended up, declining because it just seemed to be too overwhelming for her. And, looking back, this could have been the start of an amazing private practice because of the number of kids that are being diagnosed with autism spectrum. And I ended up getting a dog trainer. And we got a new dog, and I had a dog trainer, and I would give her the goals and objectives for my son, and she would take him and the dog out in the community. And it was really amazing because I would go to the bank, and people would say to me, oh, your son brought the dog. You should see. He looks at us now when he talks. And they didn't know he had Asperger's. They said, but he's not shy anymore. He looks at us when he talks to us. And when he doesn't, the dog trainer reminds him. And he tells the dog to sit once, and he tells the dog, I can only tell you once. And at the dinner table now, I would say to him, eat your food. And he'd start talking, and I'd say, I'm only going to tell you once. And so, oh, like the dog. And it was amazing how using the occupation of dog training helped my kid learn social skills through the use of, the dog trainer was my modality, so to speak. But I really would have preferred the psych OT, and she would have developed an amazing practice. But she didn't want to do it. So I was willing to pay because, I'm not going to pay for soccer for a kid on the spectrum who doesn't understand that the reason the kids on the field are running is because they're running after the ball when he's at a level where he needs the social skills. I'll pay for that. And
I bet you that dog trainer didn't ask you how he was going to bill you or how to spend the money, did he?
Absolutely not. And it was a she, and she became a very close friend of the family. And she stepped right up, and I'll tell you, I paid her more than the OT would have charged.
Well, and this is where I try to convey to therapists that we have to get out of the box of just one-on-one direct treatment in a space over here. Especially OTs. OTs need to be more out of the box than that. Just like you said with the dog trainer. I mean, an OT could have brought a dog in and used that as the medium.
Right. Or the OT could have used anything. You know, the OT could have taken him, I'm sure, trips in the community and done the same kind of thing. But, you know, I'm always telling people, parents pay for ballet, they pay for soccer, they pay for tutors, they pay for private schools. You know, I could list on religious instruction, on and on and on. They're willing to pay for something that's valuable to them, and OT is very valuable. And, you know, I look further down the road. One of the things I do in my private practice, but as a volunteer, is I mentor adults on the autism spectrum. Because I have kids, you know, I kind of feel like I hope somebody's watching out for my boys. And, you know, little things that I'm talking about, people with PhDs and people who are running organizations and people who are out there, but there are certain things they just don't know. And they would probably pay for this too. I developed this, like I said, because I want someone to do it for my boys. But parents can pay for this transitional period. You know, what do you do in high school? How do you respond when a kid makes fun of you? Or, you know, how do you get through these things? There's such a need for this. And the transition to the workplace too. You know, there are certain things, you can't tap your foot all day when you're sitting in a cubby. You know, you just can't do that. The person next to you is going to hit you over the head. So, you know, what kind of behaviors are appropriate and what's not appropriate, and how can I adjust to the workplace? And I just see that as a big role for OT. It's, you know, an unlimited role that parents will pay for because they need that transition. The whole work search process. I have parents call me all the time and say, my son graduated from college. He has a degree in computers. How do I go about getting him a job? He's on the autism spectrum. And I think there's a real need, just hand-holding.
Yes, a huge need. And OTs are so poised to help out in that area. I mean, it's such a great niche to actually be in. And it's very rewarding to see that person who didn't know how to do whatever that vocation was and take that step into a workplace and draw a check. It's
Absolutely.
very rewarding.
And people pay for it. I mean, that's the most amazing part, is that people will pay for it. I mean, I would have paid for, I couldn't do this myself because I was the mom, but I would have paid for someone to help my son organize himself when he went to college. You know, how do you decide when to study? How do you organize your day? How do you figure out when to do a paper? I would have paid for someone to do that if I knew someone who was available to do it. And I think that that's just, you know, another thing that's out there and available now because we have so many people on the autism spectrum.
That's a very good point. I want to ask you about private practice clinics or practices and the Affordable Care Act. Where do you see private practices fitting in with the Affordable Care Act as that rolls out over the next few years?
Well, now under the Affordable Care Act, everyone theoretically has to be covered. And so there should be much, much more of an opportunity for OTs within, you know, private practice as well as within hospitals and clinics. So I think that opportunity for private practice is there, and that we really need to embrace it. People who weren't covered before are now going to be covered and be able to get that, you know, that help that they needed. You're going to see people who are post-stroke, who, you know, post other conditions where they had nothing. And now with the Affordable Care Act, with habilitation, you're going to be able to treat people. And there was a lawsuit that was filed with the MS Society. You're going to be able to treat people for conditions that previously they said you can't treat anybody for that anymore. That's just, you know, it's maintenance. And we're going to be seeing a little more availability of what was previously called maintenance, which is now habilitation. So I think that this is a real prime time for expansion for OT.
I agree. I wholeheartedly agree. You know, I was here recently. I've had the thought of the technology as far as cloud-based storage and email. Do you have any insight into what a private practice owner should be paying attention to as far as their records online, essentially?
Well, I think there are some HIPAA implications for records online that everybody needs to be aware of. That you know, we have to have our records have to be secure. I know that I'm reading a lot in the legal community in Florida. There's a lot of debate about whether lawyers can use clouds because everything they do is supposed to be confidential as well. I think there's an office in Washington called the Office of the National Coordinator, the ONC, and I would recommend getting on their mailing list. That's free. They make the determination as to what requirements are for health information technology, and they they'll often have like free webinars and stuff where they'll be talking about health information technology and medical records. And I think that's certainly worth following. You know, I find personally that I have like 5 different electronic health records. One's in the doctor's office, 2 are in 2 different hospitals. And, you know, I'm very confused by it as a consumer, and I don't see anybody communicating with anybody. But the big fear is this privacy concern. I think it's important, you know, to be aware of what you can and what you can't send in an email. That, you know, there's not a lot of security in email. And that's also a concern. But the ONC is constantly coming out with pronouncements of what's allowed, what's not allowed, and what they recommend. And I highly recommend following them.
That's a good tip, because there's so much information out there, and even really, if you don't know where to find it, though, you don't know if you're following the rules or not. I think everybody wants to follow the rules. They just want to know what the rules are.
What the rules are, and when they change. Yeah, and that's the ONC is really the source, because that's the federal government.
Very good. I'll track that down and put a link in the show notes also on that. I think I've come across their website in the past and tried to follow them. So very good information. I read an article the other day. I think it was Tennessee Medicaid, and Tennessee Medicaid is doing something similar as Arkansas is in my state, where they're farming out the Medicaid system to the private insurances. And basically what this article was saying was that Tennessee Medicaid was going to lock down on what the reimbursements were for these insurances, because the insurance companies were making a lot of money, but it was draining the Medicaid money. They couldn't keep up. Eventually they were going to run out of money. Do you see anything in the future with that? I've pondered, eventually does the private insurance industry go under, and then government have to sweep in and say, you know what, you guys messed this up. We've got to take this over, and, you know, essentially you have a one-payer system.
That's a very radical thought that I kind of agree with. I mean, that was my personal disappointment with the Affordable Care Act, was that it couldn't be single payer. And, you know, there's a problem because people don't, you know, you have a whole profit-making system in healthcare in insurance companies. And if you knock out a profit-making system, you know, what happens to our capitalist system? It becomes problematic. That's one side. The other side is that we're trying to give people benefits, but if there's a profit in those benefits, the government can't afford to give them. It's a real dilemma, and some people do believe that once the Affordable Care Act fails, the only thing that's going to be left is to have a single payer, which is theoretically Medicare for all. Now, 85% of people who get Medicare like it. You won't find that with any private insurance. The problem is that, you know, Tennessee is a very good example, because they had something called TennCare before their Medicaid system, and that was a total disaster. Really, it was a problem, very, very problematic for them. And they ended up trying to follow Arkansas, and Arkansas had come up with this creative way of buying private insurance for everybody. So I think that eventually it's a problem. And one of the solutions is to have single payer. But you have a lot of people that don't want single payer because they say they don't want the government interfering with healthcare. Now, I find that very ironic. When I was a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Fellow, and I went to Canada as a fellow on an exchange to study the Canadian system, and found out that the Canadian system, they pay like 70% of healthcare is paid by the government. And in this country, it's almost the same amount. Because when you think about it, we have Medicare, Medicaid, federal employees, state and local government employees, prison health, state and federal. We have this military. I'm trying to remember all of them, but there's like 12 different healthcare systems, healthcare things that the government's already paying for. And when you look at that and you say, something's wrong with this. You know, the government's already paying almost 70% of all healthcare. Why are we, you know, arguing against it? But that's how this works. In Canada, you go to the doctor and there aren't 12 people in the front office. You know, you go and you ring a bell, you tell the doctor you're there, and you see the doctor. But then people say, well, you have to wait in Canada to get surgery. That's because we've stolen all of their surgeons, because we pay more. So, you know, there's a real problem, a dichotomy there. That's one possible solution would be to have a single payer system, but that would be problematic to insurance companies. They don't want to take out the profit. But that certainly would be a solution. Now, when you look in Washington now, and you have the Republicans tend to be against the Affordable Care Act, and most, popular opinion is against the Affordable Care Act. But when you ask them the 5 questions, do you want your kids covered till they're 26? Do you want to not have to, have your insurance taken away? Do you want to keep pre-existing conditions out of the picture? You ask the 5 questions and the 5 major benefits. People agree with those. But when you say, do you like the Affordable Care Act? They say they hate it because they don't know what it is. So, it's kind of ironic. And when you hear these alternative plans, there really is no alternative plan. One of the problems we have now is that mostly the southern states have not expanded Medicaid. So you have a lot of people who are not covered, who can't get covered because healthy adults in those states are not eligible for Medicaid coverage. So we have, a very 2-tier system, mostly in southern states, and it's kind of sad. But you hit that nail on the head, that a single payer system is an obvious solution to this mess.
When that takes us back to the point of you mentioning people will pay for the service of, what you were mentioning for your child transitioning for kids who have autism. That's a service that's probably not paid under insurance or even a single payer system. So you're going to have niches like that are not covered in insurance or single payer. And if it goes to single payer, you'll probably have a few more niches like that, more segments that are not paid that people will be willing to pay for. And that's how therapists, especially OTs, need to think. And
absolutely. It's opportunity. And, I've lectured about the American healthcare system in the UK. And what they don't understand, when you go to the UK as an OT, they say to you, do you work in medical care or social care? And you have to tell them, we don't have social care. We don't care about social care. If you have a social problem, it's not a medical problem, we don't care. And so that's what happens if we give Medicare for all. We take care of medical, but we don't take care of vocationally related care, which is some things that VR might pay for, like job search. We don't cover school care because that's not medical. I don't know how that would work because now Medicaid covers some school. So, we have military care for veterans. We have so many different types of health care or of care that aren't necessarily health, that it really, not sure what would happen, except that it would create those niches for OTs, and that's advantageous. That's really advantageous for us.
It is. If you can have your eyes open to it, it certainly is. Did you go to the AOTA conference in Nashville?
I did. Unfortunately, I didn't get there until Friday night because I was giving a keynote Friday morning, and we drove in for Friday night.
But what did you think? I wasn't able to attend. I had jury duty.
Sorry. It was a good conference. There were a lot of people there. It was the biggest attended ever.
I saw 9,000, that number thrown out.
Yeah, it's about that, maybe a little more.
That is a lot of people. What was something interesting that you saw there that you'd like to share?
Well, I was in on a session that I was actually presenting with some other people on the PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And we got all the OTs together that are involved in PCORI, and we presented about our experiences. And PCORI looks at what do patients want, and they have people reviewing research who are not just researchers. So if you're a clinician, if you're a patient, you get involved in PCORI. And it's very interesting because if there's something you want studied, you can go to PCORI's website. It's PCORI, PCORI.org. You go to their website and say, I want this studied. Like they have a place where you can put in what you're interested in. So if you're an OT and there's something you've always wanted to know, like what's the influence of this on kids, you can put that in there and say, I want this studied. You can volunteer to be a reviewer. And you learn about the process by becoming a reviewer. So that was kind of fun for me. I went to the awards ceremony, and there were several posthumous awards this year. Jane K. Smith, who wrote the textbook on pediatrics, she passed away in the last year of a brain tumor. And she got several awards, and that was a real tearjerker. I miss her.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I wish I could have been there. Hopefully next year in Chicago.
Yeah, next year in Chicago is probably going to be bigger than 9,000. So that'll be exciting.
I bet you're right. You going to present?
Probably. Haven't decided yet, but probably.
Okay, good, 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 very good. We're coming up on an hour here, so I don't want to keep you too long. Where, if people want to contact you, where would they go?
My email address is easy. It's barbarakornblau@gmail, or I'm on LinkedIn. You can contact me through LinkedIn too.
And what sort of things would you like for them to contact you about? What is your wheelhouse that you can help them with?
Well, I'm happy to give people advice on how not to get in trouble. How to avoid problems. I do talk to people after they get in trouble and kind of will steer them in the right direction, let them bounce ideas off me. But I prefer to answer questions before the fact than after the fact. And I can also lead you to there are other OT lawyers who I know. I know of at least 30 of them. There are some others around, and I can help you find them because they probably understand a little bit more about the problem, and if they're in your state, that might be helpful.
Is there an organization of OT lawyers?
We threatened one.
I don't know what the acronym. We'll have to come up with an acronym.
Yeah, we threatened one. I think I reserved the web address OT lawyers or something. I don't remember. I have to check my my GoDaddy account. And we threatened to do that. I think one of the people who's collecting names, his computer crashed. So I think we have to start up again. But if you're an OT lawyer out there or you know someone, please have them send me their name and maybe we'll get them together. I think it'd be interesting to do a textbook on legal issues in OT and have a different OT lawyer do a chapter.
Oh man, I would buy that in a heartbeat. Yes.
Yeah, I think it would make sense.
Well, Barbara, thanks for
more sophisticated as a profession, and I think those are the kinds of things we need to be worried about. So
definitely. Well, thanks for joining me. Don't go away when we hang up here, but I want people to email Barbara if you have questions and go by the website at startatherapypractice.com. And thanks so much, Barbara.
Thank you for having me, Scott.